I lived in a full family and was the only child. Our family didn't stand out from thousands of others. The mother was a tall woman, about 175 centimeters tall, with black hair and slightly dark skin, and she looked very good for her 37 years. She worked as a kindergarten teacher, and considering that it was not far from home, it could be said that she worked almost on a free schedule. She always had the opportunity to leave and come home to do the necessary things. My father worked as a welder on a classic 5-day schedule, and after work, he could still go to the garage to work on his car. So he was at home much less often. They were the same age as his mother, and he was a little taller than her, just like all men probably like to drink beer in the evening. And this made him a little overweight, or rather a certain tummy. I, in turn, grew up as an ordinary child, was thin and of average height for my 18 years. In our family, it turned out that my mother took care of me more. All household chores and worries with me, such as lessons and shopping for things, were on her. My father, due to his schedule, devoted a little less time. Of course, it cannot be said that he did not take care of me or did not love the family, but probably like all young people, I was more attached to my mother because of my age, and my father and I rarely spent time together. When he was at home, he spent time watching TV or doing useful things, while I was much more interested in playing something or sitting at the computer. And I tried not to distract him, and he did the same. But we both knew perfectly well that we didn't have any kind of classic father, sans communication. In fact, everything was fine with us anyway, and everyone was happy. But there was no such thing as it should be in people's minds, to play football together and get involved in something together. And then one day my father probably decided to fix it. I don't know if he wanted it himself, or if his mother somehow told him that it needed to be done. In addition to work and household chores, my father was also fond of fishing, which was hardly a serious hobby. But he had several different fishing rods in a small suitcase with fishing lines, baits, and all kinds of gear. He went fishing only 6 to 7 times a year, and then only in the warmer months. And since it was already May, and the weather was correspondingly warm, it was time for the first camping trip of the year. And this time, instead of going out alone, he decided to take me with him. It wasn't very interesting to me, but I went with him anyway. Early Saturday morning, when it was just dawn, we went to the river. The road took us a little more than an hour, and now we are already there. It was a pleasant slope overgrown with grass. The river near the shore was covered with reeds, but there were small clearings in which we settled down. I won't tell you how the day went. I'll say that in the end we fished pretty well, and the bite was good. When it was already dark and the fish stopped pecking, we left the fishing rods abandoned on the shore. We settled down nearby, built a campfire, and began to have dinner before going to bed. Of course, we were both in high spirits and talked a lot. My father, knowing that he wasn't going to drive today, started drinking beer. Because of his age, he hadn't offered it to me yet. And of course, when he had a few drinks, he began to ask me in a fatherly way how I was doing in life. We talked about my studies, what I'm good at, and what I'm not. He gave examples from his past about how he was at my age. He asked about my friends, about how and with whom I communicate. It's worth saying that we hadn't had such close conversations before, but then the situation probably pushed us to communicate. Then he asked a little humorously about the girls, about whether I like someone, and if they run after me. I answered him honestly, there are people I like, but I'm too shy to talk to them. He also encouraged me, saying that he felt the same way at my age. And I would be glad if some senior friend would at least tell me how to communicate with him without hesitation. He had already drunk a little alcohol in him, and he told me in a fatherly way, let me help you show you how to communicate with girls. I'll talk to my mom so that we can just walk in the park somewhere and you can see that there's nothing wrong with communication. The main thing is to keep the conversation going, and that's it. Okay, he asked. Okay, I replied a little awkwardly. Of course, I was interested in learning how easy it is to communicate with girls, but most likely, I just enjoyed communicating with my father as a friend. Our further conversations were about curious incidents at his work, and I listened to it with pleasure. After finishing dinner, we went to bed. When we woke up Sunday morning, we went fishing before lunch, as the good biting continued today. But after lunch, we packed up and went home. Upon arrival home, it became noticeable that my father and I became more friendly. We could joke about something, and my mother spoke very positively about our communication. Literally a working week passed, and my father went fishing again. And of course he took me with him again. I won't bore the reader too much. I'll just say that we left the same Saturday morning and did everything according to the same plan, even staying at the same place. In the late afternoon, having decomposed to eat, my father got himself a beer again and drank it a little. Our conversation started with fishing. We discussed the catch, and then we talked about various topics. After some time, my father got a little drunk and started talking about my friends, asking me and being interested. I answered him sincerely. Then he asked about my studies and my progress in general, and I started to notice that he was asking the same thing as the last time. Of course, I tried not to attach importance to this. I tried to reassure myself that maybe he wanted to ask something again and so on. But as much as I was offended, these were the same questions as on the previous fishing trip. He kept asking and being interested in me, and I already knew what the next question would be. Of course, my enthusiasm has completely faded, and when he started asking about the girls if I had someone, I couldn't stand it. I answered him with resentment. Dad, we already discussed this last time. Didn't we? Don't you remember that? Don't you remember that I answered you? I said. There was a deathly silence after my words, and after a couple of seconds I continued. Didn't I tell you that I'm not good with girls? You said you'd talk to your mom. Don't you remember that? I added, yeah, well, I remember everything, of course. I talked to my mother, of course, but you know yourself that she is stubborn in our country. He said uncertainly, touching his shoulder a little in a friendly way. But everything was clear to me. He didn't talk to anyone about anything. For him, our last conversation was nothing more than just the conversation of a drunk person. Of course, he remembered in fragments that he wanted to talk to his mother about something, and that I told him something about myself and my friends and in general about my life. But it wasn't really important to him, and he ignored most of my story. It was very disappointing for me because I felt that by opening the door of trust to him, I had deceived myself. He also realized that it was his fatal mistake, and that the thin, friendly bridge that we had built was completely destroyed. After talking about nothing for a while, we went to bed in the next day, getting up in the morning and realizing that there would be no bite. We immediately went home. Already on the way, it was clear that our communication had not just rolled back and completely degraded. After this fishing trip, we began to live a normal life. I went about my business, my father his, and no one thought about her anymore. A month had passed, and it was already June and one day on a day off. When my father and I were alone, he called me to his place, and in a fatherly way, with a very pleased face, he asked if I remembered our conversation. Of course I answered in the affirmative. Did I promise to talk to your mother? Although it was difficult and very unusual, she agreed to help us, and this weekend she will go fishing with us. Have I fulfilled my promise? He said, not hiding his complacency. Okay, let's all go together, I said, not understanding what the mother and fishing were talking about. Of course, I did not know how events would unfold next, or rather, I did not guess, but I was pleased that we would go to nature with the whole family. When the week came to an end, we gathered outside the city. As usual, we got up early on Saturday and went to the river. Looking at the destination, it was already traditionally the same place where my father and I were, and the nature was more beautiful there, and the fish were well caught. Of course, it was difficult to call our trip fishing in the truest sense of the word. It was more like an ordinary trip to nature, with a tent and a barbecue. Immediately upon arrival, we set up our small double tent, searched for and prepared firewood for a barbecue. In general, our tourist camp was busy. My father and I went fishing a bit, but we spent more time cooking, eating, and just chatting on various topics. In the late afternoon, when the sun had already set, we all sat around the campfire and slowly ate what we had on the makeshift table. I was already a little tired during the day and realized that I didn't really want to sit and listen to their conversations for a long time. That's why I said I was going to sleep in the tent. They didn't stop me, but they were a little surprised, or rather even excited. My mother fell silent and straightened her back, as if she wanted to get up. My father turned away a little, as if he hadn't heard what I was saying. Without giving it any importance, I went into the tent and already began to prepare for bed. There was quite a little space inside, and it was designed only for two people lying next to each other. There was no more space there. This is not surprising since it was not expensive, but an ordinary tent bought in a chain store. I got under the covers and heard some conversations between my parents, but I couldn't make out what they were talking about. And literally, 3 to 5 minutes later, my mother looked into my tent, climbed inside, took off her shoes and just lay down next to me in her clothes. We both were silent. It is worth describing my mother in more detail. As I have already said, she is a tall woman, dark-skinned with dark hair, with a good figure. In real life, most likely because of work, she were only a corporate style. And no matter how tried it may sound, it was precisely these things that emphasized her femininity. We were lying next to her, with our feet to the tent's exit, and we didn't talk. But then she probably decided, or most likely realized, that this prolonged silence looks very stupid, and Mom sat up, facing the exit, because there was no other way. Anyway, my father told me that you have problems with girls. He really wants me to help you with this. I don't know why I am the one, but he really wants it, she said. Let's say you're probably familiar with the theory. Let's get right to practice. Allah might help you if you really need it. She added that the words she said were not directed at anyone. She just spoke like that, and was a little indignant at this awkward situation. And then I realized everything a puzzle of all the pieces formed in my head. It became clear to me that in our conversation, in which my father thought that I was telling him that I couldn't make love to girls even though we were just talking about communication. I was like a cotton doll just lying there watching and couldn't do anything. I lay there and tried to concentrate on the sensations, but it didn't work out very well. In the end, we made love in this tent. There were a lot of thoughts in my head, but they were all just fragments. There were no coherent ones. It was quite difficult for me to fall asleep. It wasn't even a dream, but like some kind of half-nap, I woke up quite early. It became clear because the sun was not yet shining strongly on the tent, and some birds were singing outside. My mother was lying next to me and still asleep, since it was always cold in the morning. She lay with her back to me. Yesterday's events came back to my mind, and I was shocked by what had happened. That's how we spent the night fishing with our parents.